With Monster Hunter 6 absolutely dragging its feet to get here, there's still a fair chance Rathalos is going to get another competitor. The frequency of his conflicts over the series has led to something of a joke that he always loses to the new flagship. But this is pretty unfair, as Rathalos has only ever once been seen to be a victim of intra-guild predation in the series, and wins or draws far more turf wars than he loses, and only really loses against the superpowered weeb or developer pet monsters. But then the frequency of such conflicts also leads people to debate who, of the many candidates, is the best true rival to the King of the Skies. So who is the best Rathalos rival? This video will focus mainly on mainline species, with less influence from one-time things like deviants and no crap from Frontier or Online. In last place is Leana. It may seem weird to have someone on the list who doesn't even fight with Rathalos, but Leana is set up as something of a foil to him. They're both aerial apexes, and the researchers at Astera do compare them, saying that Rathalos rules the skies one way and Leana another. So clearly they share the rank of King of the Skies, with Leana being the New World King given the relatively recent arrival of the Wraths in the New World. Leana is also the thematic opposite to Rathalos, with blues and whites replacing reds and blacks, ice replacing fire, a shrill wail over a throaty bellow, and being a graceful acrobat in moveset compared to an armoured bruiser. Leana is the blue Oni to Rathalos's red. But Leana is last on this list as none of this really comes to a head. Pink Rathian will appear in the Coral Highlands, and so presumably conflicts have occurred, as well as when Azure Rathalos fly from the recess to the forest to mate. But in-game, their rivalry only exists in the diametric symbolism of the two monsters, and not in tooth and claw. Number 7 is Nagakuga. Whilst the two had little to do with each other in the past games, Nagakuga was brought back in Iceborne specifically as a rival to Rathalos. Perhaps the top predator of the old world jungles, it's fitting that it should be introduced to draw against the apex of the ancient forest, in a true jungle battle. The developer team were saying they wanted a monster that was the physical equal to Rathalos. And it's not a bad rivalry. They've overlapped in the past, theories can be built from it. The two have a pretty cool introduction fighting each other, and one of the best turf wars. Nagakuga winds up at number 7 though, as for a rivalry it's introduced so late, and only really feels like it fits the ancient forest. Outside of maybe the older swamp maps, one or both of the monsters feel out of place when they share an environment. So whilst Nagakuga made for a good Iceborne specific rival, it's not something that feels like it really lasts. Tigrex is number 6. Since 4th gen, Rathalos and Tigrex have occasionally been teased to have something of a competitive relationship. In the initial trailer for 4, the two have something of a scuffle, and then in Iceborne they actually have a turf war. But said scuffle doesn't result in physical contact, and their turf war is a copy and paste. It makes sense that in areas of overlap like the Ancestral Steppe especially, that they would compete fiercely. They both take the large herbivores of the regions they inhabit. They both like open terrain and are both very belligerent. Whilst Tigrex obviously has some tiger inspiration, Rathalos was actually intended initially as the flaming lion wyvern, and lions and tigers have had centuries of artistically depicted conflict. But as the series has progressed, both Tigrex and Rathalos have somewhat abandoned their pantherine inspiration, as more direct stylistic references to lions and tigers have entered the franchise. So a rivalry between the two in areas of geographic overlap would fit pretty well. But this has always been one competition Capcom seems to have had in mind, but never fully and properly developed. So Tigrex remains only at number 6. But another Tyrannosaur pulls ahead to number 5. Which is Ananth. Whilst not often counted in such discussions, Ananth absolutely belongs on this list. The conflict between the two species is frequently depicted in Monster Hunter World. It was the high point of one of the early demos, it's the loading screen for the game, It's depicted in extra media and was also used to market the game too, as well as in the Iceborne trailer as well. So their hostile relationship in the ancient forest is pretty well established, and their turf war is also loaded with significance too. Anjanath is the boogeyman of the early game of World, lurking in the background of the ancient forest to occasionally lunge out and attack, or even maul your quarry instead. He's almost the first true boss of the game, so to see him get dispelled by Rathalos reveals him as just a small fish in a big pond, and in a way makes Rathalos a sort of greeter for the higher ranks of the game far past Anjanath. It also installs Rathalos as the true king of the ancient forest, as up until you see their turf war, you'd be forgiven for thinking Anjanath was the top dog. Rathalos is everything Anjanath wants to be. The latter is feathered like a bird and has frills that look like wings, but he can't fly. And he's merely the savage of the ancient forest rather than its true apex, despite Anjanath's lust for more victims to bully. From his nest, in their turf war, and in general, Anjanath is always forced to look up at Rathalos in his lofty position. They're both big, red, angry fire monsters, but there can only be one king. The one-sided power dynamic of their relationship is why Anjanath is comparatively so low. Whilst some species-based rivalries can still occur with that, a single spotted hyena would struggle with a lion, but they're both social species, and so are perhaps the Holocene's best-known predator rivalry. But whilst Anjanath and Rathalos inform each other's character as monsters, Anjanath is only number 5. Number 4 is Astalos. Astalos was meant as a rival to Rathalos with his creation in Monster Hunter Generations. You get the hero's blade in Kokoto village after slaying him instead of Rathalos. You fight him in Rathalos's home in the forest and hills, and Astalos was meant to represent first gen of the Fated Four, although it's questionable how well they do that. Above all else too, he also won T-Com and Shark's poll on who the best Rathalos rival is. The game depicts them as rivals with the opening cutscene showing the two fighting, and they're well matched. Rathalos can easily keep pace and dodges Astalos's lethal tail, with the fight ending inconclusively. But since then, Astalos hasn't really filled this role. Coming back in Sunbreak, Astalos really has nothing to do with Rathalos. As seemingly a bug and drone eater, Astalos will have minimal competitive overlap with Rathalos in terms of resources. They share maps and Astalos is Suzuki's favourite monster, but they have no turf war or really any form of interaction at all, hence why Astalos remains just number 4 in this list. Number 3 is Lagiacrus. Lagiacrus is perhaps the original Rathalos rival, as he's the first monster seen to be truly in conflict with Rathalos. The first showdown the latter ever had was in the Tri opening, when the two faced off over an Aptonoth kill. Rathalos technically wins in that he gets the kill, but it can't be said there's much of an actual fight here as cool as the build-up is. The two were thematically set up as rivals. In 3rd gen, Rathalos is weakest to thunder and Lagiacrus to fire, and Lagiacrus's title is Lord of the Seas, versus Rathalos being King of the Skies. In the 3rd gen size comparison, the two face off again, but also without actually engaging in a fight. But with all that, this rivalry hasn't grown much since, though a large part of this likely comes from Lagiacrus's spotty reappearances in the series since 3rd gen. He had a phoned-in fight in Generations where he wasn't going to get anything with Rathalos, with its minimal focus on ecology, Astalos being made as the new rival, and Tri being less of a focus than Portable Third. He didn't appear in World or Rise or their respective DLCs, despite originally being slated to be in the former. Who knows, maybe we'd have finally got the Rathalos-Lagiacrus turf war if he had. For all we know, the animation is sitting on a Capcom hard drive, hopefully waiting to be unleashed in Monster Hunter 6. But even with that accounted for, there are limits to their rivalry. As Lord of the Seas and King of the Skies, the two don't mix all that much. Both of them technically have to leave their respective domains to fight each other on equal footing, as Lagiacrus can't fly and Rathalos is presumably a poor swimmer. So it'll never be that fair of a fight, and as true a test of their abilities as it can be. And whilst the two do have range overlaps along coastal and riverine areas, Rathalos's truest rival must be someone it shares more of its habitat with. So number 2 is Glavenus. Glavenus was envisioned as a land-based Rathalos from its conception, both being big, angry red fire monsters, which is a little odd to start off as he's seemingly meant to represent 4th gen, and Generations itself. Whilst in 4th gen the two don't really have that much to do with each other, in 5th gen Glavenus comes back in Iceborne, and has turf wars with Rathalos. Whilst these aren't unique turf wars, the only change is Glavenus uses his tail in the Deviljho Rathalos animation instead of Dragon Breath, and they straight up copy the Rathalos Anjanath one. It is worth noting they're the only duo to get different results depending on where they fight. So even if the copy and paste strikes again, then there's still more thought put into this than the usual reusing, with Rathalos dominating in the upper regions of the Ancient Forest and Glavenus the lower. With this being Glavenus' first foray in a mainline game, it's interesting to consider if this rivalry will be built further in future, considering they already seem keen on it. The two also have a lot of overlap in their behaviours and ecology. Both live in forest plain mosaics, as well as volcanoes, and have similar diets and are notably hostile to intruders. So there's considerable resource overlap, and Glavenus' competitor behaviour may go even further. In both generations it's seen to also fight Rathian too, so it has conflict with both sexes of the species. Whilst in Generations this is presumably to show Glavenus as the toughest of the fated 4, wrong, and that it doesn't draw but instead wins its fight. But in Iceborne the Glavenus follows Rathian back to her nest, possibly attempting to predate her or raid the nest, so it could possibly pose a direct threat to Rathalos' progeny and mates too. That gives it something of a level up compared to most others. But it is still only the 2nd spot. Who is the number 1? Before we get into it, Rathalos does have a few more turf wars and competitive ecological interactions. But with monsters like Deviljho, Rajang and Magnamalo, these are much more to show off how cool and epic and strong these monsters are, rather than actually building a rivalry or anything similar. Despite the gag of him constantly losing fights, Rathalos is only once seen to be the victim of integral predation, in Sunbreak when one is killed and partially consumed by Malzeno. Presumably it had to be a flying wyvern eaten. Steve already gets smashed by Shagaru and Astalos is Suzuki's favourite, so it really had to be Rathalos. There are other implied instances, either in-game with monsters like Nakakos or in lore with monsters like Deviljho. But as a large and powerful wyvern in its own right, the King of the Skies is sufficiently armed to minimize threats to itself. So who is its greatest rival? The number 1 spot is Serios. Serios is perhaps the only one of this list specifically designed as a rival to the Wraths. When given his list of key features to make his localized name in the West, one of the key words was Rathalos' rival, and that he was especially made such a good flyer with his agile moves, specifically to rival the current King of the Skies. His signature golden scales aligned with the mica to be fire-resistant to Rathalos' chief element, rather than weak to it like Lagiacrus. The two are seen to fight directly in 4 Ultimate as well, with the two striking harsh blows on each other, but ultimately coming to a stalemate between equals. Their conflict is seen in other media too. In the 4th gen size comparison video, Serios is seen to harass Rathian, with Rathalos coming to her rescue to once again stalemate Serios. And this also adds to why Serios is the best Rathalos rival, in that it has an equal rivalry with both sexes. Some try to argue that Serios is Rathian's rival over Rathalos's, which makes no sense as they're literally the same species. The fact Serios maintains this rivalry through his tenure in the games makes him the top dog in this regard, even if they miss out giving a Rathalos-Serios turf war in Sunbreak, due to it focusing more on monsters that shared the opening generation, over ecological relevance. Serios' intro is still it attacking and killing a Rathian. Ecologically, it still ticks all the boxes. It shares resources with Desert Rathian and Citadel Rathalos as a large predator, presumably raids their nests to eat their chicks and attacks both genders of adult, and maintains this conflict through the series. Serios is built from the ground up as the true rival to the species over just the male, making him the ultimate Wrath rival. But what do you think? Who is Rathalos' best rival for you? Will another monster steal Serios' golden crown? Could Glavenus or Nagakuga or even Tigrex come back in 6 to get a supreme turf war and claw themselves up in the rankings? Or will a brand new exclusive monster do it better than any other? Right now, many rivalries only have a flimsy basis, with only one half of the series having ecological aspects as a primary concern, and only really 5th gen doubling down to try and extend the lore and create a more extensive story. This isn't much of a surprise. But as the series moves forward and such things develop, canonical competitive rivalries and other combined aspects of monsters and story may grow, and maybe we'll get some more fully fledged ones. Thanks for watching, and especially to patrons Phenomenon, The Super Stupa, Sonam Lobsong, K Sandom, Big Al, Eringar Steiny, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Original Username, Inventory Overflow, Tristan Berry, Evely, Howleth, Archazor Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zaysir, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu for their ongoing generosity keeping the channel going. A link is provided in the description if you want to join up, and any amount is always appreciated. And thanks for all the comments on the most recent Spec Evo short. There were a lot of fair points and queries and such to address, but I think I'll save them for the next Spec Evo short to make sure I hopefully get most of the return audience again. Let's also not talk about Tokyo Game Show. Truly the content drought really drags on. Especially as I have no plans for anything related to Monster Hunter now, as that's barely even a title. It shouldn't be a surprise this video wasn't exactly planned in advance, but is more recycled from an earlier and even more tongue-in-cheek April Fool's video concept. 1, I was busy over the past few weeks and wanted something short and simple to make. 2, I thought it could still be a fun topic to address. And 3, if you didn't make an obnoxious top 10 video in your time on YouTube, were you even a YouTuber? The next video will also be another recycled concept again, albeit more typically serious, and then it'll be back to the more usual Monster Hunter analysis videos. As ever, I hope I'll see you there for them.